we are going to cover the second half of Joshua 9. So why don't we start out, you look at your outline, let's read verses 16 through 21 of Joshua 9. And it came about at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. Then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Berioth and Kiriath Yarim. And the sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. This we will do to them. Even let them live, lest wrath be upon us for the oath which we have sworn to them." And the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Now, also you'll notice, and we'll get to it, but in verse 23, it makes a more specific statement. It says, "Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease from being slaves, both of hewers of wood and drawers of water, for the house of my God." So that's the verse that tells you that they're part of tabernacle service. All right? It's interesting. In verse 16, and after 3 days it becomes evident. 3 days seems to be a significant number. Can you think of other important elements in 3 days?
Jesus rose from the dead.
On the third day. Okay. Can you think of other things about 3 days? How about the book of Revelation?
Something in the book of Revelation.
There are two interesting guys.
Oh, that witnessed for 3 days?
Yes. No, that rise from the dead after 3 days.
Right. Yeah.
They're killed by Antichrist, the two witnesses. They're killed by Antichrist after 3.5 years of ministry. And then it says in about 3 days, they resurrect from death and, of course, are taken back into heaven. Moses and Elijah, undoubtedly. So there's a lot of interesting things that happen on 3 days. Now, I want to show you, let's look at a couple of verses here about the wisdom of listening to people, okay? Let's turn, because we're going to look at Proverbs. So turn over to the book of Proverbs. And we're going to start in the beginning in chapter 3. Yeah, that's true. You've studied Proverbs a lot. So Proverbs 3, we're going to read verses 5 through 7. It's a very famous proverb. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And here's the hard part. Well, maybe the first is the hard part too, but the second is, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. That's a great admonition. It's what we all need to aspire to. And certainly it's what Israel and Joshua did not do in this situation. So let's go from the 3rd chapter of Proverbs, let's go over to the 12th chapter of Proverbs. Proverbs 12. Verse 19. Here Solomon tells us, truthful lips will be established forever, but a lying tongue is only for a moment. In other words, if they'd waited, they would have learned the truth. But they didn't wait. They rather impulsively made a decision and made a very serious oath, and we're going to see even more evidence of how serious it was. And then in Proverbs 19, turn over from 12 to 19. in verse 9, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will perish. And of course, the Gibeonites didn't perish in that sense, but certainly their false witness did not go unpunished because of what they end up having to do. If you go to the end of the New Testament, to the book of James, you have another similar admonition that's given in James, first in chapter 3, James 3. He starts, and I'll read 13 first, or verses 15, but who among you is wise and has understanding? Let him show by his good behavior, his deeds in gentleness and of wisdom. In verse 15, this wisdom, this quote, wisdom, knowledge, okay, is not that which comes down from above, but rather is earthly, natural, and interestingly enough, demonic. In other words, that which is not God's truth is ultimately Satan's lie. It may be packaged as truth. Look at our culture around today. Look at the distortions that go on. Look at the excuses that occur for unbelievable behavior in our culture. They're packaged as being wise. The sociologists tell us, the professors in colleges tell us, these great individuals tell us. But ultimately, if they're not of God's truth, it's a lie. So be careful of that which appears wise, because it's often not wise. So we see that if they had waited a while, it would have become obvious that the Gibeonites did not live far away. They're only 7 miles from Ai, over the top of the mountain more, so they could not be seen. They're only 7 miles away. Neighbors. So finally, after they make the pact and they realize they've been duped, Israel's been duped, then they send out envoys to look at the cities where the Gibeonites have come from. And they see these several cities that we just mentioned here in verses 16 and 17 back in Joshua. Okay, so go back to Joshua 9. Now, the people want the Gibeonites killed because they realized they were Hivites, and also because they lied and deceived. We see in Numbers 30, verse 2, that the leaders realized at this point their problem. They'd made a pact. They'd made an oath to in God's name, and therefore they could not undo it. They would be in worse trouble if they broke the oath rather than just going with the oath, even though it was, impulsively made. So the people, I think, understandably grumble about this.
I know that this is what the Bible says, but even though they made the wrong covenant, or they made a covenant that was wrong, so why couldn't they back off of that and say, oops, we made a mistake, sorry folks?
Well, turn to Numbers chapter 30.
I mean, isn't that what we do when we forgive someone, or when we...
Yeah, but this
Well, they had invoked the Lord as the battle.
Yes.
All right, okay.
Okay,
all right.
here's Numbers 30, verse 2. If a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, which is exactly what they did with the Gibeonites, he shall not violate his word. He shall do all according to that which proceeds out of his mouth. That's God's standard.
Okay.
In other words, don't unwisely make an oath.
Yeah.
Don't unwisely put yourself in a contract. Don't unwisely make an alliance. But if you give your word, then you're supposed to keep it. So we're supposed to be very careful about how we would, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more.
Bring the Lord into it.
They made it absolutely as a covenant with the Lord.
So basically, even your marriage vows are that.
Sure. You're making a covenant to the Lord as a Christian, to the other person. Yeah. Now, I want to talk about what I think, we'll see if you find this interesting too, an interesting element here. We see these cities in verse 17. There are 4 of them mentioned. The last one is Kiriath Yarim. Kiriath Yarim. Now, I want to give you an exercise on what I'm calling follow the clues. Because I think you may listen to what I say and in the information I put in outline and ask yourself, where did he get that? Okay? And a lot of what I put in these outlines are following the clues. In other words, for instance, this is what we're going to do tonight about Kiriath Yarim. I want to see us follow the clues and look at the information we come up with by simply following the clues. So, as you do a search for Kiriath Yarim, one of the first things you come to, and we're going to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 6. So go to the right, 1 Samuel chapter 6. Verse 21.
I'm sorry, 1 Samuel?
Chapter 6, verse 21. Okay? Says, so they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Yarim, saying, the Philistines have brought back the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you. So we learn an interesting thing about this city and the inhabitants. After the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant from Israel, it ends up, they have all kinds of problems with it, if you remember the story. And they finally realize, we got to get rid of this thing. So they drop it off at Kiriath Yarim. And the inhabitants of Kiriath Yarim at this point take care of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
All right, now, let's go to the next chapter. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 7. Well, literally, in the same page. And look at what it says in verse 2. And it came about from the day that the ark remained at Kiriath Yarim that the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So, the ark didn't stay there for a short period of time. It stayed there for 20 years. Go ahead.
Weren't the people blessed while it was there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now remember, this is a city of the Gibeonites. This is a city of an originally Amorite group of people. And yet God allows the covenant to be taken there. Not only allows it to be taken there, but it's there for 20 years. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it gets some more interesting. Go over to your right further, past the Samuels and past the Kings, and go to 1 Chronicles 13. First Chronicles 13. And we're going to look at verse 5. So David assembled all Israel together from the Shihor of Egypt even to the entrance of Hamath to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Yarim. So when David becomes king in approximately 1000-ish BC, one of the things he does is he sends for the Ark that's been sitting for 20 years at Kiriath Yarim, and they bring it to Jerusalem. Okay?
They don't do it right.
Well, they don't. They actually bring it to kind of outside of Jerusalem. But the point is they're bringing it back to where originally, ideally, it's supposed to be, and of course where it ends up being in Solomon's temple. So that's the next thing.
They didn't put it on a wagon here, did they?
I'm not certain. I don't know that I studied the whole passage there. So.
Oh, they put it on a new cart, and that's where somebody touched it and died.
Oh, okay, all right. That's.
They weren't supposed to put it on a cart, though. No, they were supposed to carry it. Right. With the Levites were to carry it. Right. Okay.
Now I want you to then turn to the right quite a bit further, and I want you to go to the book of Jeremiah, to chapter 26. And here's another interesting tidbit about Kiriath Yearim. Starting in chapter 26 of Jeremiah, starting in verse 20. Indeed, there was also a man who prophesied in the name of the Lord, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, from Kiriath Yearim. And he prophesied against this city and against this land words similar to all those of Jeremiah. So we find that out of Kiriath Yearim comes another prophet. He prophesies at the same time that Jeremiah prophesies. But he has a slightly different end than Jeremiah, because the king at that time, Jehoiakim, decides he doesn't like what this prophet Uriah says, and of course, this prophet Uriah runs away to Egypt. The king sends envoys down to Egypt. They find him, they bring him back to Israel, and they kill him. So he has a relatively short prophetic life here. But where does he come from? And he is a prophet of the Lord, is Kiriath Yearim. Now, the peoples of Kiriath Yearim, after it becomes a Jewish city, are all included in a tribe who ends up serving the temple service. As I said to you before, this group is called the Zorathites, because they have a relative called Zorah. Okay? And from that particular family group, which is Gibeonite in its element, comes, of course, this group that are associated with temple service. Now, I want you to look, since you're in Jeremiah, I want you to go back to the left. I want you to go back to 1 Chronicles again. And we're going to look at chapter 2 of 1 Chronicles. And we're going to go to the end of the chapter. We're going to read verses 52 and 53. This is where you get the information that I just told you. And Shobal, the father of Kiriath Yearim, had sons, Horiah, and half of the Manathites, and the families of Kiriath Yearim, the Ithrites, the Puthites, the Shumathites, the Mizrathites. From these came the Zorathites, okay, and the Eshtalites. And then it goes on and says that, of course, the originator of the Zorathites, of course, is this guy Zorah. So, this is where you get the information about their family line that comes through them.
What verse did you start with?
I started with verse 52 of chapter 2. Yeah, chapter 2.
That's the wrong chapter.
Now, Kiriath Yearim has a very odd identity. And I want to show you, it's rather bizarre. So, go back now to the book of Joshua. And we're going to learn some more things about this city. We're going to go to chapter 15 of Joshua. Starting in, well, actually, we're going to go to 1533, but I'll mention starting in verse 21 of Joshua 15. It says, now the cities at the extremity of the tribe of the sons of Judah toward the border of Edom in the south were, and then it names all these cities, okay? So this is the territory of the tribe of Judah. And in verse 33, it says, in the lowland, Eshatal and Zorah. Here we go with that man and his family, the Zorathites. So it says that they're a part of the tribe of Judah. Okay? Doesn't that seem clear? Well, let's see if we can make it muddier. Go a few chapters over to Joshua 18.
Dear.
You don't have any of that on here, right?
No.
No.
It's an extra thing that I'm just...
Oh, okay.
No.
We all a little confused here.
We're trying to stay with you. But
Many names, many information.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, then ask questions. What are you not catching?
So, as we read from Joshua 10, from our verses, Israelites go through this city named Kiriath Yearim.
It's one of the cities of the Gibeonites.
Okay.
Okay?
And
what happens is that as the Jews take over the city, the inhabitants are still there, okay? And out of that, there's a family group from this city of Kiriath Yearim. That family group is called the Zorathites.
Okay.
And the Zorathites, according to that, what we said and what we looked at in 1 Chronicles 2, they are a group that's part of the service of the tabernacle.
Okay.
You follow? Okay. They start out in the city of Kiriath Yearim. And their relatives end up being a family group called the Zorathites. Follow?
Who served the tabernacle.
You serve in the temple. Go ahead, Michael.
So they started the service at the park when it was in the city.
Say again.
They started the service
This
when
family
it wasn't.
group attended to the ark
Yes.
in the city of
Right. I mean, obviously, all the Gibeonites couldn't be in the service of the temple. I mean, there'd be thousands of them. So there are certain elements of them that do that. Some of them hew wood and carry water for all of Israel. In one passage, it says in chapter 9. But a select part of them hew wood and water and service the tabernacle. That's the Zorathites.
And those are people from Kiriath Yearim.
Yarim. Absolutely. They are Gibeonites.
Okay, I'm still not following. So, although they are, do you mean although they're part of Amorites that are serving in the tabernacle?
Yes. That's what it says in Joshua 9. All right? Are you with me?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Now, we just saw in Joshua 15:33 that city and the family group in it is part of Judah, the territorial tribe of Judah. Okay? Matter of fact, I should have had you put up a map of the tribes. I don't know if we can do that or not, but if you can, it's fine. Now, turn to Joshua 18 so I can make this muddier for you. Starting in verse 21. Now the cities of the tribe of the sons of Benjamin, according to their families, were Jericho, da-da-da-da-da, and look at verse 25. And Gibeon. So how can they be part of the tribe of Judah and be part of the tribe of Benjamin? Well, one thing, and I should have gone to the map originally, but one thing that you'll see on a map, if we can get it up here, is that Gibeon sits in this interesting intersection area between Judah and Benjamin. Okay? No, that one isn't going to show it because it's not a map of it. But, well, maybe we can find it, maybe we can't find it, I don't know. But anyway, they sit in this interesting area, kind of in between those two. All right? Now, finally, let's go to Joshua 19, the next chapter. And starting in verse 40, this is inheriting. They're talking about inheriting the land. Each tribe gets their area and their cities, okay? So in verse 40, this is the inheritance of the tribe of Dan. It says, the seventh lot fell to the tribe of the sons of Dan according to their families. Verse 41. And the territory of their inheritance was Zorah. Okay? The Zorathites. So now you see There you well,
I don't think that's it.
that's not really it.
You want the 12 tribes?
Yeah, okay, I should have thought ahead. Anyway, so now it says that their city area is included with the tribe of Dan. Now you go, okay, they're part of Benjamin, and they're part of Judah, and then they're part of the tribe of Dan. How could that be?
Change boundaries?
There's no tribe that's described like these people, okay? There's nobody that moves around like this, like these people. So let's try to follow it further. You could also notice that there's a mention of Gibeon in Judges, we don't have to turn here, but in Judges 13:2, because in this area of the tribe of Dan, a famous person comes from this. His name is Samson. And he's of the tribe of Dan in this area also. Mm-hmm. Now, the Danites, including this family group of Zorah, you'll see in Judges chapter 18, and I'm going to just tell you this, but if you want to look at it for your own, you can. Judges 18 is an interesting story. This group of Danites, including Zorah, begins to roam over into the area of Ephraim, another tribe. They end up, in the story, going into the house of Micah and stealing actually an element that's in the house of Micah. They then travel north up to this little city, and I don't think it's going to show it on that one, called Lachish. It's way up north, and unfortunately, it's literally just south of the Mount Hermon, almost as far north as you can go in Israel.
It's on my map.
Okay, can you see it?
It's in my Bible.
Okay, so they go to Lachish, they come into the town, they murder the inhabitants of Lachish, and they take over the town, and they call it Dan. Mm-hmm. So at a point in time, you find that Dan is now up in the very northern part, literally practically on the border of what we would call Lebanon today. Now,
it's in the Golan Heights.
Yeah, it's in the Golan Heights area up in the north. Now you find in Judges, well, there's a couple references, but you find that the Danites end up merging with this group in Lebanon. Remember those famous cities Tyre and Sidon up in Lebanon? And they're part of this empire called the Phoenicians. Mm-hmm. All right? The Phoenicians have a notoriety of being maritime people. They have great ships, and literally we have evidence that probably they were all over the world. They go across the Mediterranean. It appears quite evidently that they crossed the Atlantic, because we've literally found gold Phoenician coins, interestingly, outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Okay? They go down south. There's evidence that they probably were down in Florida. They go through Africa. They travel everywhere, and they're very wealthy merchants. Well, in Judges chapter 5, verse 17, again, you don't have to turn there, but if you want to look at it, you can. It's this thing called the Song of Deborah, who's a judge of Israel, and she refers to the ships of Dan. So we have a biblical reference that Dan apparently merges with the Phoenicians, and they become travelers and marketers and maritimers with the Phoenicians. Now, in a document, it's actually a book called the Old Jewish Encyclopedia, there's also a story in there, this is part of Jewish history, where it says that they become part of and connected to Sidon, which is one of the cities of the Phoenicians. So we have evidence in Jewish records that they're part of Sidon. Now there's something that's even more interesting. By the 6th or 7th BC, which is the earlier age of Greece, we find archaeological evidence in Greece that they've married into one of the Greek king lines because there's a reference to the Danites. Not only is there a reference to them, but in one of the king's burial chambers, we've found a bronze emblem that is an emblem of the crossing of the Red Sea. How would the Greeks know about the crossing of the Red Sea? It's evidence that they were partly influenced by the Danites, who of course had that.
About that.
Yeah, I've mentioned about it before. So finally, we notice another interesting thing about the Danites and part of this Zorite group. We also see in Revelation 7, which we studied last year, in verse 4, it mentions all of these 12 tribes and 12,000 from each tribe, the 144,000 Jews. And interestingly enough, who's missing from that group? The tribe of Dan. All right?
And Levi's been included.
Yeah, Levi's included, and Dan's. So we have in this a very odd and mixed legacy of these peoples from Kiriath Yearim. Another thing I think it's interesting. If you go to their word, the Zorathites, one of the root verbs is the word sarah, which interestingly enough means leprosy.
Mm-hmm.
You can find it mentioned in Leviticus 13 verse 44. There's another part of the word that's actually the word sirah, S-I-R-A-H, which is called a collective feminine noun in Hebrew. Isn't that interesting? And it means a nest of hornets, or it can be translated a place of troublesome men. Now, that's a rather interesting bit of information from looking at one city, isn't it? And all I did is follow the clues. I went from cross-reference to cross-reference to cross-reference, looking at all the references to Kiriath Yearim, and you come up with all this information. So I want to show you that when we read quickly over a passage, you're going to miss a lot, because embedded in it is information. If you take the time to follow it, there's a lot more information you'll find out.
Question.
Yes.
If you would explain that to a little child, and you will have to put it in one sentence, like bottom line, about what you just said. So I think you actually said that we have very mixed.
The people of Kiriath Yearim have a very, very mixed legacy.
Okay.
Some of it's very good, some of it's very bad.
Okay. So good were serving tabernacle and
Taking care of the Ark of the Covenant for 20 years.
And that became part of Phoenicians and, okay.
And they allied with the tribe of Dan, and of course they become, again, you just follow the breadcrumbs. Isn't it interesting?
It is.
All right. Of course it's on the quiz. You have to explain all of it.
No. So typically, tribes didn't do that. They didn't travel around like that.
No,
Is that kind of
they're supposed to stay in their territory.
Kind of the point that makes them different. Tribes typically stayed and took care of their own.
Remember, God gave them their territory. It's by a lot of the Lord. Whatever the lot was, however that lot was cast. Okay? God tells each tribe where they're going to be in Israel. They don't have any right to move around. That's their territory. But Dan, in this area around there, in the Gibeonite area, they didn't listen.
This is a dumb question, but are they still predominantly in those areas? I mean, different tribes?
No.
I mean, the descendants, so to speak?
No, because Israel, after the diaspora, Israel became.
Right.
So
right.
all of that changed, and certainly the genetics of these people are still around. Their descendants are still around.
Right. Well, I just wondered if they kind of, when they went back to Israel, they would say, well, no, wait a minute.
No, it's no longer. They no longer take the tribal inheritance as being the jurisdiction of Israel at this point. So, all right, now back.
So that city sat right on the edge of Dan
and Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
It did.
So all the people of that two-word
town place,
Mm,
were Gibeonites, but all the Gibeonites weren't from that town.
correct. Because there were 4 different cities just mentioned there of Gibeon, of the Hivite group called Gibeonites.
But what you've been speaking of is just this 2-word place.
I just picked one city, and I followed the information about that one city.
Well, let's not speak to others.
But the point is, all that information is in the Bible. It's just there to be dug out.
Yes, it sounds almost like one separate big study.
It is.
Just on that one.
It is. Now, I want to talk about another thing. There are some interesting lessons to be learned about the pact with the Gibeonites. I want you to turn to the New Testament, and I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians. And we're going to look at chapter 6. 2 Corinthians 6. And we're going to start in verse 14. Here's a very interesting passage. It is the subject of a lot of discussion in commentaries. You could read through commentaries and see a lot of interesting perspectives on what this means. Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Belial being representative of Satan, okay? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. And I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. And then chapter 7, verse 1, therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilements of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Now, if you've ever read a verse that seems to be contrary to the concept of diversity, this is it. If you've ever read a verse that talks about the issue of non-inclusion, this would be verses. Okay? It seems like a rather elitist concept, doesn't it? But what's the point?
God chose his people for a purpose. They were to be separate, and they were to take him to them so they would know who he was and what he's all about.
Isn't it interesting?
And they didn't do it.
They didn't do it, at least not completely. Isn't it interesting that now, even 2,000 years later, after the dispersion of the Jews around the world, a large segment of them still act separately? You still have areas of countries that are Jewish all around the world. And they've kept their Jewish distinctives for thousands of years. Now, not all of them have, but a segment of them still does to this day. And interestingly enough, even of those groups, frequently they don't even know why they do it. You know, they go to Hebrew school in their early years, and they're taught all these traditions of Judaism. They're taught about the Seder during Passover. Many of them even practice the Seder meal. But ask them why.
Well, here in Columbus,
Yeah,
there's a segment
there are.
that is
Go to Bexley.
right.
Oh, yeah.
Predominantly Jewish.
There's still that distinctive element, even though they've lost their understanding of why to a great extent. Now, I want you to go all the way back to your left to the Old Testament book of Exodus. And I want to show you an example of something. We're going to go to Exodus chapter 12. Obviously, Exodus 12 is about them coming out of Egypt. It's about the Passover. It's about God leading them out, enacting the 10th plague, which is the killing of the firstborn of each house in Egypt. And of course, after that happens, that night, Pharaoh says, "Get out of here, I can't stand you." And he kicks them out. Now look at verses 35 and 36 of chapter 12 of Exodus. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and of clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now I'm going to recommend to you that that was a big mistake. I'm going to show you why. And then
The big mistake that the Egyptians gave.
That they ended up wanting all that gold and silver and took it from them.
Because they made.
Just stop. Go ahead. Just a second. Now I want you to look to verses 37 and 38. And I want you to see one more thing, next two verses. So they grab all this gold and silver from the Egyptians, okay? And look at 37 and 38. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from the children. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds and a very large number of livestock. What's that tell you?
Well, a lot of the Egyptians went with them.
There you go. Not just the Jews left Egypt. A mixed multitude went with them.
Ah.
So embedded in Israel were Egyptians.
Ah.
Okay? Now let's look at what happens. Turn now to Exodus chapter 32.
Wasn't a lot of that, though, gold and stuff used in making the tabernacle?
Maybe eventually it was. I'm not certain. But look at chapter 32. We're going to read verses 1 through 10, okay? Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. He's been 40 days on the top of Mount Sinai." And of course, on top of there's fire and thunder and lightning. And they think, this guy ain't going to survive that. Verse 2, and Aaron said to them, "Tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who you brought up from the land of Egypt." Now, where do you think they got the idea of a golden calf?
In Egypt.
Right, because it was an Egyptian god, well known to the Egyptians. So Israel has now been infiltrated by the Egyptians. They now make an idol that's in the form of an Egyptian god, and because they do this, what ends up happening?
God told them to kill each other.
Yeah, the Levites wipe out part of the element that does this eventually, but they make burnt offerings, and of course God ends up. It says in verse 10, now then let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them, and I may make you, Moses, a great nation. Of course, Moses intercedes for them. But the point is, it all occurred because of two things. They accepted gold and silver when they left, and they were a mixed multitude. And bad things happen.
But God told them to get those things from the Egyptians.
He allowed them, I think, to get those things.
Okay.
He allowed them to plunder them. but it was an unwise move on their part. He never said, go do it. He allowed it to be done. Okay? Now, go ahead.
Okay. Used to be when I read those verses, I thought it was referring to Christian versus non-Christian instead of Jew versus Gentile. Is it both or just Jew and Gentile?
Well, that's why I went to 2 Corinthians, because here he talks about, in that context, Christian versus non-Christian. The point I'm making is this. This is the issue of the compromised life. This is why Paul warns us not to live a compromised life. Many people interpret that verse in 2 Corinthians, don't be yoked to unbelievers, as being a statement about marriage. That's just part of it. We're to ask ourselves a question in all categories: is it wise to be bound to that person?
What do you mean by bound if not by marriage?
Bound in a contract, bound in a business, bound in whatever it may be, because often it doesn't go well. And the principle of mixed multitude is not that the mixed multitude rises spiritually, but rather the group descends to the level of the, quote, mixed multitude. And that's what happens. That's why he uses the image in 2 Corinthians of two unmatched oxen yoked together trying to pull a plow in a field. It don't go well.
No, it doesn't.
You don't get straight rows. You'll never get them as long as they're unmatched to each other. That's the literal image he uses. So, there.
Big bull and a little bull?
Okay, that's the image he uses there. So, all I'm saying is this. This is not a statement, and Paul even says, he says, I'm not saying don't relate to the world, because you'd have to literally go outside of the world to not relate to the world. It's not a statement that you don't relate to the non-Christian world. It's not a statement that you don't be of service to the non-Christian world. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that in crucial relationships, be careful to be bound.
What is non-crucial?
Important, critical relationships.
Now, does this rely to
Okay.
lesbian and the gay? I mean, we don't necessarily turn our backs on them, but yet we don't. How's that?
Well, I think the point is that obviously, in many, many, many verses, the Bible does not endorse homosexual lifestyle.
Right.
Definitely.
But at the same time, you don't not relate to those individuals. Right. Okay? Your obligation is to show Christ's love to all people.
Right.
Yes, but you're not supposed to be among them. You're supposed to be.
Well, wait a minute.
There's a difference between relating to and endorsing. Okay? But there's absolutely no question when it comes to any group, whether it's gay and lesbian, whether it's racial groups, whatever it is, we absolutely have the mandate that we're called to show Christ's love to all people.
Including Muslims.
Everyone. Okay? But there's a difference between showing love to them and being of service to them, and putting yourself in certain relationships with them
be among them.
that can then bring you into a position that's not spiritually good.
What do you mean among them?
Yeah. Clarify the among you business. I'm not sure I agree with
Well,
that.
if you associate with those people, it's all right to bring the Word of God to those people, but you're not supposed to be a part of those people. So if you're involved in commerce, if you're involved in some kind of relationships, some kind of a marriage, and you knowingly know those people have a different agenda, then you're not supposed to be a part of that. And if you have that amongst you in your church, you're not supposed to allow that to exist.
Now, do you realize that in the church group, as we go in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul clearly says that in each group there are servants of Satan.
That's right.
We are very idealistic often in a church group. We assume that everyone says they're a Christian is a Christian. That's not necessarily true. They may or may not be. Okay? That's not that they're unwelcome to fellowship. At the same time, though, Paul makes a very clear statement. Realize that, and we're going to go into it here in a minute further, because I think the parable of the wheat and the tares is an important parable. We're going to get to it in a second, and we'll advance into that more. But let me finish this, okay? The Gibeonites come to the base camp at Gilgal. This is where they work their deception among the Jews. Now, what had just occurred weeks before at Gilgal?
Victory.
Well, not at Gilgal.
Oh, not
It's the base camp on the other side of the Jordan. What's the first thing Israel did when they got to Gilgal?
Circumcised.
Yes, they were circumcised. It literally, the word that was used is the reproach of Egypt was rolled away. Okay? The men, for the first time in 40 years, were circumcised, and they were demonstrating in their bodies that they were God's unique people, a separate nation. Okay? It was the Old Testament image of what in the New Testament we call putting to death the deeds of the flesh. The identification of the new life from the old life. It was at this very place that they fell to their own reason and pride. Israel did. They deemed that it was sensible, that the evidence appeared clear, and that they made a pact which cost them almost an instant war. They were deceived by the agents, and I think spiritually in this sense, of Satan. They were infiltrated. They made a pact with someone they should never have made a pact with. This is one of the things that we should learn, the principle of spiritual deception. Remember, it says that Satan is like a roaring lion. Now, that's his offensive side, but he's also called a liar, he's called a deceiver, and he's called an angel of light, who Paul says appears much like the servants of righteousness. We're called to be careful spiritually. We're called to be careful. Now, despite the moral deceit which caused them to make this oath with the Gibeonites, God honors the oath. And I want to show you an example of how he honors it. Turn to 2 Samuel. Chapter 21. And we're going to look at verses 1 and 2 of 2 Samuel 21. This is a very interesting reference that is not mentioned, interestingly enough. This incident is not mentioned other places, but the writer of 2 Samuel picks it up. So verse 1 of 2 Samuel 21, you there?
Not yet.
Now there was a famine in the days of King David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the presence of the Lord. Now think about it. That's pretty severe, a 3-year famine. There's going to be a lot of hungry people around in Israel after a 3-year famine. So finally, and who knows why it takes 3 years, although 3 is another interesting number, repeated again. Here we find that David finally pleads and seeks the Lord and says, why? And the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house because he put to death the Gibeonites. Interesting. Verse 2. So the king, that is David, called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the sons of Israel had made a covenant with them. He repeats what we just read in Joshua, okay? But Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So, 400 years after Joshua makes a covenant with the Gibeonites, Saul decides that he's going to purge Israel, and he starts to kill the Gibeonites. And God says, stop. I'm penalizing you. And they have 3 years of famine because they broke the oath. 400 years later. You talk about a God who remembers things. Okay? The oath still is applicable. That's the whole point. Once it's made, it's applicable. Now, back to Joshua chapter 9, and I'll try to, as Gary always said, land this plane. Let's read verses 22 to the end of the chapter, to 27. Joshua 9, starting verse 22. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you, when you are living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease from being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water, for the house of my God. So they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all this land and destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and we've done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hands to do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. Verse 27, but Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. So that became their permanent ministry, as it were, in Israel. So the Gibeonites literally become servants of Israel, especially in relationship to temple activities. Now, I want you to note something as we close here. Go back a little bit to the left to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23. We're going to start in verse 3. Here's a prohibition. No Ammonite, that would be the Gibeonites, they're part of the Ammonites, right? Or Moabite, which includes people like Ruth, who later are born, okay, shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord. Now,
the Amorites and Moabites are descendants of Lot.
yes. Now, isn't it interesting? Except Rahab is an Ammonite.
And Ruth is small.
And Ruth is a Moabite. Now, one of the things that you, if you don't read this in Hebrew, one of the things that you don't pick up is the word Ammonite in Hebrew is the male term. So is the word Moabite. It's in the male form.
Does not apply to me.
It doesn't apply to women. Remember, someone said, and again you pointed out, that they would make peace with the non-seven nation groups and that they could marry the women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That was allowed. And then they became ultimately, by the 10th generation, part of national Israel. But not until 10 generations of them had occurred. Which is interestingly why we see that Rahab, who's the great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus, as in Matthew, if we count the generations in the book of Matthew, guess where Jesus' descendants are? They're in the 11th generation. So they are included all in national Israel at that point.
Who did Rahab marry?
Solomon, who was a prince of the tribe of Judah. Now, as I said, it should be noted that just days prior that the Gibeonites send envoys to Gilgal, that all of Israel, just before that, were at two mountains. Half of them stood at the bottom of one, Half of them stood at the bottom of it. They were called Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Remember, we just went through that. And what did they hear as they stood there? Half of them at Ebal and half of them at Gerizim.
Curses and blessings.
And the whole law was read to them, all of the Torah. They just heard it. Weeks, if that, before this event occurs. It shows that we all have a very short attention span spiritually.
That's true.
Don't we?
It's not funny, but you're so right.
It's very true. Okay? We really do. Now, interestingly enough, at a later time in Israel, at a time of renewal, during the return of the remnant under Nehemiah and Ezra, we see a different attitude spiritually by Israel. Turn to the book of Nehemiah, go to your right, and go past Samuel and Kings and Chronicles and Ezra to Nehemiah, and go to the 13th chapter of Nehemiah. And we're going to read verses 1 through 3. Remember, this group of approximately 50,000 has come back from Babylon. They've left because they were told after 70 years, you go back. A small percentage of them come back, but at least about 50,000 of them do. And it says, starting verse 1, on that day they read aloud from the book of Moses. Now they read the whole Torah again. In the hearing of the people. And there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Didn't we just read that? Okay. Because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but they hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it came about that when they had heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. They did something that the Jews in Egypt didn't do. They decided if you're not a 10th generationer, you're on your own. If you're a 10th generationer, you're part. Okay? But only those people could be a part. So, we see that, the reference, of course, is in Deuteronomy 23:3 about the 10th generation. And we see that these 10 generation people are allowed to stay because they're now part of national Israel. And we see them show up and building the walls around Jerusalem and, of course, doing other things too. So, these people recognize the importance of separateness and discretion about who to trust and who to associate with if they are to accomplish important spiritual tasks. The story that's talked about here, we're not going to go into it, but the story about Balaam and King Balak is in Numbers 22, verses 3 through 11. It's a very rather humorous story, actually, in many ways. It's where we talk about Balaam's ass.
Yeah, right.
Okay, talking to him. Yeah, because he is hired. Balaam is not a Jew. He's, I think he's I don't know if he's from Moab. I have to look, but he's hired to deceive Israel. And so he goes through all these things to try to deceive them, but it doesn't work. And at one point, of course, when he's on his donkey, he's going to do something, and God says, no. And an angel shows up, of course, in that instant, and the donkey recognizes the angel, although Balaam doesn't. And the donkey is not going to move. And so Balaam starts beating on the donkey to get him to move, and the angel has the donkey speak and says, are you a moron? I'm not moving. So he tries to curse Israel, but he can't curse Israel because God doesn't allow him to curse Israel. It's a very frustrating ministry for Balaam, but it's an interesting story. Now I want to finish by reading one passage, and it's in Matthew 13. We should pay more attention to this passage. Matthew 13, and we're going to read starting at verse 24 to finish tonight. This is the parable of the wheat and the tares. remember, wheat and tares, until the grain is formed, look absolutely identical. You cannot tell them apart. Only when they have seed can you tell them apart. So, starting verse 24. And he presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares also among the wheat, and then went away. But when the wheat sprang up and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How does it have all these tares? And he said to them, an enemy has done this. And the slaves said to him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? And he said, no, lest while you are gathering the tares, you may root up the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather in the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but then gather the wheat into my barn.
Studied this today.
What's the point? What's Jesus trying to say here to us?
The good and evil are going to coexist till the second coming.
Yes. The good and evil will coexist in the kingdom of heaven. There will be those that are false agents and those that will be true believers. And that the false agents will do their work, but the true believers are to carry on the true work of God. And in the very end, as it says in 1 Corinthians 3, each man's work will become evident. Okay? God will separate the true from the false in the time of the believer's judgment. So, bottom line, be vigilant. Aware. Looking out.
Have your lamp lit, be ready.
That's right. I gave you a lot of information tonight, okay? A lot to digest, and probably to digest it all, you're going to have to go back in your notes and kind of reread some of this. But I just wanted, in going into Kiryat Yarim, I wanted you to show you an example of how do you find out information in the Bible. You know, like I said, it's amazing what we overlook. We read it, we go, oh, okay, that sentence, and yet we never take time to say, okay, what's in that sentence? Embedded in it is an awful lot of information.
I have a tendency to take it at face value and not question it, you know. It makes a flat statement, okay, you know, rather than digging into it.
Yeah.
You know.
All right. Michael, would you close us so that we can, we're going to have a little celebration here, aren't we? Okay, so close us with
Heavenly Father, just give us discernment so we can understand your word. I know that I'm having a difficult time with, and I pray for your help to allow me to assimilate